For years, Susan Dey seemed to live the kind of life most young actresses could only dream about. She was beautiful, successful, admired, and surrounded by millions of people who believed they knew exactly who she was. On television, she became the picture of youthful innocence, a girl whose smile made everything seem simple and safe. But behind that carefully polished image was another Susan Dey, one almost nobody could see. A young woman carrying grief from childhood, struggling under the crushing expectations of fame, fighting to protect her identity, and quietly trying to build a life far away from the character audiences believed was the real her. She became famous before she had fully learned who she was. And perhaps that was the greatest danger of all. Because while America watched Susan Dey grow up in front of the cameras, she was living another life behind them, one filled with private fears, painful relationships, difficult choices, and a growing desire to disappear from the very world that had made her famous. What happened to the girl America once adored? Why did she repeatedly push away the spotlight when Hollywood seemed ready to give her more? And what was Susan really running from? The answer can be found in the life she rarely allowed the public to see. Susan Dey was born on December 10th, 1952, in Illinois, into a middle-class family. Her father worked as a newspaper editor, while her mother was a nurse. From the outside, her childhood seemed ordinary, almost peaceful. But when Susan was only 8 years old, everything changed. Her mother died, leaving a wound that would quietly shape much of Susan's emotional life. She was still a child, yet she was forced to experience something that would make even an adult feel vulnerable and alone. There was no celebrity image to protect her then. There was no audience waiting to applaud. There was simply a young girl learning, much too early, what it felt like to lose someone she loved. Instead of becoming openly rebellious, Susan became quieter. She withdrew inward and learned to keep difficult emotions to herself. It was a pattern that would follow her into adulthood. She would become exceptionally skilled at appearing calm, even when something inside her was falling apart. After her mother's death, Susan's father moved the family to New York and later remarried. Her stepmother, Gail, noticed something in Susan that even Susan herself had not yet recognized. She saw a distinctive beauty, a natural innocence, and a quality that cameras seemed to love. Gail began taking photographs of Susan and sending them to modeling agencies. At first, Susan had no idea that those pictures would become the doorway to an entirely different life. By the age of 15, Susan had begun modeling. She was young, striking, and almost impossibly photogenic. The work gave her something she had never completely possessed before: recognition. People were suddenly telling her that she was beautiful, that she had potential, that she could become someone. For a girl who had experienced loss so early, that attention may have felt strangely comforting. But there was a hidden danger in becoming admired before learning how to value yourself without outside approval. Susan was still only a teenager when the entertainment industry discovered her. In 1970, at 18, one of her modeling photographs caught the attention of producers connected to a new television project. She was chosen to play Lori Partridge on The Partridge Family despite having little formal acting experience. Within a remarkably short time, Susan had gone from teenage model to one of the most recognizable young faces in America. The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. The Partridge Family became a cultural sensation. Millions of viewers watched the show. Albums sold. Fan letters poured into studios. Susan's face appeared in magazines, posters, advertisements, and bedrooms across the country. She was no longer simply Susan Dey. To the public, she was Lori Partridge, the sweet, beautiful teenage girl who seemed to represent the perfect American youth. And that was where the double life truly began. The public saw a confident young star enjoying every second of success. But behind the scenes, Susan was still trying to understand who she was. She had entered Hollywood so quickly that she had never been given the chance to grow privately. There was constant pressure to maintain the image everyone had fallen in love with. She was expected to remain youthful, beautiful, slim, polished, and almost impossibly perfect. That pressure affected her relationship with her own body. During the height of the Partridge Family, Susan reportedly followed extremely restrictive eating habits in an effort to maintain the appearance expected of her. At her lowest point, her weight reportedly dropped to around 41 kilograms. Yet the cameras never saw the struggle. When filming began, she smiled. When interviews started, she remained composed. When fans screamed her name, she played the role they expected. America believed Susan Dey was living the dream. But Susan was learning that fame came with a price. She was suddenly expected to master acting, music, public appearances, and the emotional demands of being a teenage idol. She had to learn while millions watched. Every flaw could be magnified. Every change in appearance could become a subject of public discussion. And every mistake threatened the perfect image television had created around her. Then, just when Susan seemed to have found everything she had ever been searching for, another problem appeared. She could not escape Laurie Partridge. The show ended in 1974 while still enormously popular. For the audience, it was the end of a beloved television series. For Susan, it was the beginning of a much harder battle. She had become famous for being one particular kind of girl, and Hollywood had very little interest in seeing whether she could become someone else. Susan understood that if she stayed inside the same image, she might spend the rest of her life being remembered as a teenage sister on a musical sitcom. So she began taking risks. She appeared in Hawaii Five-0 and took film and television roles that were meant to show audiences she was capable of more. She also appeared in Little Women in 1978 and other projects that demanded something different from the cheerful persona viewers remembered. But escaping a beloved character is not as simple as choosing a new role. Susan took a major gamble in 1977 with the romantic sitcom Loves Me, Loves Me Not. She hoped it would prove she could lead a different kind of series. Instead, it collapsed quickly and was canceled after only 6 episodes. For someone already fighting against an old identity, the failure must have felt like confirmation of Hollywood's doubts. Yet that same period produced something far more important. In Mary Jane Harper Cried Last Night, Susan delivered a performance that revealed a completely different side of her abilities. Instead of the gentle teenage girl audiences remembered, she played a troubled young mother facing a psychological breakdown. Critics responded positively, and for perhaps the first time, Susan received meaningful evidence that she could be respected for talent rather than remembered for nostalgia. But her biggest transformation was still ahead. In 1986, Susan was cast as Grace Van Owen on L.A. Law. Everything changed. The role gave Susan something the Partridge Family never could: authority. Grace Van Owen was intelligent, ambitious, powerful, complicated, and emotionally strong. She was not created simply to make audiences smile. She was a woman with convictions, responsibilities, weaknesses, and a career of her own. Susan understood the importance of that distinction. She reportedly pushed back against storylines that might reduce Grace to nothing more than a romantic interest. She wanted the character to remain independent, and that determination became part of what made Grace Van Owen so memorable. Susan was no longer trying to prove she could escape Laurie Partridge simply by playing someone older. She was proving that she had become another person entirely. The transformation was enormous. L.A. Law became a major television success, and Susan's performance earned her a Golden Globe and multiple Emmy nominations. The actress who had once been dismissed as a former teenage idol had now become a respected dramatic performer. For the outside world, this looked like the perfect ending. The former child star had survived Hollywood and reinvented herself. But success did not erase the past. Susan continued taking increasingly challenging roles, including emotionally difficult television projects such as Lies and Lullabies, where she portrayed a pregnant woman battling drug addiction. These were not easy characters. They required vulnerability, emotional darkness, and a willingness to show audiences a woman whose life was collapsing. And perhaps there was something deeply symbolic about that choice. For years, Susan had been required to hide anything messy. Now she was building a career around characters whose lives were anything but perfect. Still, the personal side of Susan's life was becoming increasingly complicated. One of the most painful chapters involved her relationship with David Cassidy. They had met as teenagers while working together on The Partridge Family. On television, they played brother and sister. Behind the scenes, Susan developed strong feelings for Cassidy. She admired his humor and charisma and became emotionally attached to him in a way the public never fully understood. But their realities were completely different. David Cassidy was surrounded by enormous attention and admiration. Susan, meanwhile, carried her feelings quietly. The two eventually spent a night together after The Partridge Family ended, a moment Susan reportedly viewed as deeply meaningful. But the relationship did not become what she hoped. Years later, Cassidy discussed the encounter in his memoir, bringing private details into the public sphere. For Susan, the pain was not simply that the relationship had failed. It was that something she had experienced as deeply personal had become part of a story that others could read about, analyze, and gossip over. That betrayal was different from ordinary heartbreak. It was the exposure of something she had wanted to keep hers. Susan reportedly cut contact with Cassidy afterward. When he later attempted to apologize, the damage had already been done. Their connection, once filled with youthful possibility, had become one of the most painful memories of her life. And there was another reason this wound may have been so powerful. Susan had already lost her mother as a child. She had already experienced abandonment and emotional uncertainty long before fame arrived. Then, after building a life around the idea of trust, another deeply personal bond ended with exposure and disappointment. It was becoming clear that Susan's private life was shaped by something very different from the glamorous image America knew. She wanted safety. She wanted control. And above all, she wanted a private space where she did not have to perform. Her relationships would repeatedly reveal that struggle. After her connection with David Cassidy faded, Susan became involved with Dale McCraven, a writer and producer. The relationship offered a different kind of emotional experience. Instead of the overwhelming excitement associated with celebrity romance, there was companionship and stability. Dale knew the entertainment world, yet he was not the star everyone was watching. He could see Susan as a person rather than as a television icon. For a young woman who had spent years being watched, that difference mattered. But their relationship eventually ended as their lives moved in different directions. In 1976, Susan married Lenny Hershin, a veteran Hollywood talent manager who was significantly older than she was. Their relationship appeared to offer the stability she had been searching for. They later welcomed a daughter, Sarah, and motherhood gave Susan something fame never had, a real sense of home. Yet even that marriage could not survive the pressure surrounding Susan's life and career. She was trying to balance motherhood, marriage, and a professional identity that was constantly evolving. Her husband represented stability, while Susan was still fighting to redefine herself as an actress. Their age difference and different expectations for the future added to the tension. By 1981, the marriage had ended. Again, there was no explosive Hollywood scandal, no sensational war between two celebrities, just a relationship that had reached the point where staying together created more pain than leaving. Susan moved forward with her daughter, carrying another emotional scar. But perhaps the most important change was happening inside her. Susan was slowly learning that peace could not come from other people deciding what her life should look like. Then came Bernard Safransky. Their relationship was very different. Bernard was an experienced television producer who understood the world Susan had spent decades navigating. By the time they met, Susan was no longer the insecure teenage girl who had first walked into Hollywood. She was older, more experienced, and far more protective of her private life. Bernard accepted not only Susan, but also her role as a mother. Their relationship developed away from the sensational headlines that had surrounded Susan when she was young. In 1988, they married. And for Susan, this marriage represented something larger than romance. It represented peace. She had spent so much of her life being watched, judged, photographed, discussed, and interpreted that she had gradually learned the value of disappearing. And that is where the second life of Susan Dey truly emerged. The woman America had once known began stepping farther away from Hollywood. Her appearances became less frequent. Her projects became more selective. She returned as Grace Van Owen in 2002, but these appearances felt more like a reunion with a chapter of her past than an attempt to restart the machine of fame. By 2004, after appearing in Third Watch, Susan effectively stepped away from acting. There was no giant farewell, no dramatic press conference, no desperate attempt to remain relevant. She simply stopped, and that decision said more about Susan Dey than any award ever could. Because for decades, the entertainment industry had taught her that staying visible was important. Susan eventually decided the opposite was true. Being invisible could be freedom. Away from Hollywood, she was finally able to live without constantly being compared with the girl she had once been. She could enjoy ordinary routines. She could spend time with family. She could live without cameras waiting to capture every expression. For someone who had spent her youth being watched by millions, ordinary life was no longer boring. It was precious. Susan also continued supporting causes connected to survivors of sexual violence, including work associated with the UCLA Rape Treatment Center. This was another side of her life that the glamorous television image had never revealed. She no longer needed a television audience to give her actions meaning. Her impact could happen quietly. That may be the clearest way to understand Susan Dey's so-called double life. One life belonged to America. It was the beautiful teenager, the beloved Lori Partridge, the successful actress, the Golden Globe winner, the woman whose face was recognized almost everywhere. The other life belonged to Susan herself. It was the grieving child who lost her mother, the young woman who struggled under the pressure to remain impossibly thin, the actress terrified of being trapped forever inside a character, the woman who experienced heartbreak and betrayal, the mother who wanted to give her child the stability she had once lost, the wife who learned that security could not always be found inside marriage, and finally, the woman who discovered that happiness did not require an audience. That may be why Susan Dey's story feels so different from the typical Hollywood success story. She did not simply rise, succeed, and disappear. She spent decades trying to reclaim ownership of her own identity. The girl America loved was real, but she was never the whole story. The smile was real. The talent was real. The success was real. But so were the wounds nobody saw. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Susan Dey became most famous at the exact moment she was least prepared to deal with fame. She was still growing emotionally when the world decided who she was supposed to be. Everyone wanted Lori Partridge. Everyone knew her face. Everyone had an opinion about how she should look, what she should become, and how long her career should last. Very few people were asking what Susan wanted. Years later, she answered that question herself. She wanted privacy. She wanted authenticity. She wanted a life that did not require her to smile on command. And perhaps most importantly, she wanted to become someone who was not defined by the people watching her. Susan Dey will always be remembered for the Partridge Family and L.A. Law. Those two roles represent completely different stages of the same remarkable career. One introduced her to millions as a symbol of youthful innocence. The other established her as a serious actress capable of portraying women with intelligence, authority, and emotional complexity. But the most important character Susan Dey ever played may have been the one that existed after the cameras stopped rolling. Herself. For years, she lived between two worlds. One was bright, public, successful, and carefully controlled. The other was quiet, private, complicated, and deeply human. And while millions of people believed they knew Susan Dey, the truth is that they mostly knew the version she allowed them to see. Perhaps that was never deception. Perhaps it was survival. Because sometimes walking away from the spotlight is not giving up. Sometimes it is the first time a person finally chooses themselves. Susan Dey spent her youth becoming the woman America wanted to see. She spent her later years becoming the woman she wanted to be. And that may be the real secret behind the double life she lived for so many years. The world remembers the actress. Her family remembers the woman. And Susan, after a lifetime of being seen by everyone, finally found the freedom to live where almost nobody was looking. That is why her story continues to fascinate people. Not because she was famous, but because, in the end, she chose something fame could never give her. Peace. And after everything Susan Dey had survived, perhaps that was the one thing she had finally earned.